So we got this feedback API route here. And now as part of that function, I want to accept an incoming request with the email and feedback data and then store that somewhere in a database, in a file, or for development, maybe also just in an array. And therefore, to implement this, we now have to do one important thing. Inside of this handler function, we have to find out which kind of request is triggering this API route. Because when we submit that form here, I soon want to send a HTTP request with JavaScript, and I'll do this with the fetch function here. We could also use a third-party library like Axios. That does not matter. But I'll send a request from inside my JavaScript code. And I will send a post request because I don't want to get data, instead I want to send data. So we would typically use a post or maybe also a put request. Now, since that's the goal, here inside of that handler, we need to find out which kind of request is triggering this function execution. Because by default, all kinds of requests will trigger this function execution. Get requests, post requests, put, delete, everything. Now, I only want to try and extract data from the request and store it in a database or somewhere else if it's a post request though. So therefore here we need an if check and we need to find out which kind of request was sent. And that's easily done with help of that request object, which we get automatically by Next.js when this function executes. This will give us information about the incoming request. And for example, there we'll have a method property, which allows us to find out which HTTP method was used. And we can simply check if that was a post request here, if it's a post method. And if that's the case, then inside of this if check, we could try to extract data from the incoming request and then store that extracted data in a database. Now let's say we expect our incoming post requests to this API route to have this email and feedback text data field in the request body. That is something we could expect because we're the ones writing the code for this API. Then we can easily extract data from the incoming request with help of more properties that exist on this request object. To be precise, with help of the body property which exists there. This will be the already parsed body of that incoming request. So Next.js will automatically parse the incoming request body for us, so it will give us easy access to the data attached to the request through that body property. And then body will just be the value that was sent with the request. So let's say here in our front end, we will soon send a request which carries a body of a JavaScript object with an email field with some data and with a text field with some feedback text data. That could be the structure we want to use in this application. And since we are the developer of this application, of this website, we can of course use any structure we want. So now we would send this object with a request to that API route. So on that API route, we could now expect that on this body, we get our email with request body.email because we have an object as a body which has an email property. And it also has a text property, so we can extract that as well. We can also get our feedback text by accessing request.body.text then. So that's how we can extract the data from the incoming request if it's a post request, and then here we could store that in a database. So here we could create a new feedback object where we add this email and text, and then maybe also add a unique ID to have, a unique identifier for every new feedback. And here, during development, I'll just create a new date object and convert that to a string. It's not a perfect unique ID because theoretically, 2 requests could be sent and handled at exactly the same time, but during development, that's good enough. It's a dummy ID we can use here. So now we would create this feedback object, and we could now store that in a database or in a file or anything like that. Now here during development, I will store it in a file, and I'll create a new data folder. The folder name is up to you though, in my root project folder. So not inside of Pages API. You should not create it there, but just in my root project folder. And in there, I'll add a feedback.json file. The file name is up to you though. And my goal is to open that file and store my data in there when we, get that feedback. For this, I will import fs from fs, so import the file system Node.js module. And we can use Node.js code here because this will run on the server. And this will only run on the server, never somewhere else. And it will be executed with Node.js. So we can use all the Node.js features here. And I'll also import the path Node.js module here. And then here we can store that in a file by constructing a path with the join method to that data folder and there the feedback.json file, by getting access to the current working directory with process current working directory, which will refer to the overall project directory, then diving into data and then into feedback.json. And this will create an absolute path to that folder for us. So that's my file path then. And then we can use the fs module to write to a file. And here I want to write to that file path. And then the data which I want to write is actually this data. However, to be precise, I actually want to read the file first, fetch the data which is in the file, and then override it with the updated data. And therefore, to do that, I'll first of all read the file. And I'll do this with read file sync to do it in a synchronous blocking way. So I'll read that file here, and that gives me my file data, so the data which is currently stored in that file. And that will be some JSON data. So I'll now convert it to a JavaScript object to work with it by executing JSON parse file data. Then that data should be an array, let's say, and therefore I'll add an empty array inside of this feedback.json file as a start. So this is an empty array for now. And then we interact with that array. We know that it will be an array because we own that file. And I push my new feedback into that array. And then I want to write it back to the disk. So then I use write file, and I'll use write file sync to again do this in a blocking way here. And I'll write my file here by again targeting that file in that file path. And now the data which I write back is again the data converted back to JSON with the JSON stringify method. I pass in my updated data here, and that then writes the data to the disk. That's the goal. That's how this should behave. And then once we're done with all of that, we want to send back a response. So then here I'll set a response of, or with the status code of 201, which signals success. We added data successfully. And then any data of our choice, for example, an object sent back as JSON, where I say success in my message property, and where I maybe also send back the new feedback object that was created. So that will send back a response after we successfully updated our file, and it sends back an object in JSON format with a message and a feedback property. This line of code would also execute though after we go through this if check, because function execution does not stop just because we set some response data. Hence, to not send two responses, which would cause problems, we should move this code into an else block so that this does not execute if we just make it here into this if check. Okay, so now we spent a lot of time on that, but now we got some server-side code added to this API route using API route specific features like looking into the request, extracting request body data, and running server-side code and sending a response. And with all that added, we can now connect our front-end code to that backend by sending that request to that API route to then see whether that works.